Welcome back to the Carbon Trust Route to Net Zero Africa event. A quick reminder, actually, that you can find us on social media. So if you're on Twitter or LinkedIn, we've also linked in some of the speakers. So you'll see here the last session on the screen behind me. So if you want to follow the speakers, this is a great way to find them. Why not say hello, and please do use the hashtag, which is Net Zero Africa. That's all one word. I can see lots of people from across Africa joining. So welcome to those of you from the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Uganda, Swaziland, Ethiopia, a lot of people from South Africa as well. Welcome to all of you. Now, this next panel session is live, so please do ask questions over on the right-hand side. We'll also try and incorporate some of the relevant questions from the last session, and we'll make sure that the team respond to you after the event if you didn't have your question asked in the last session. This one is titled Net Zero and How to Make It Happen. Renata Lawton-Misra is here from the Carbon Trust. She is a manager in the Carbon Trust Africa office with many years of experience in delivering a variety of projects across the private sector, including low carbon mining, transition risk assessments, climate change strategy, and green finance. Renata, welcome, and over to you.
Thank you, Ralph, and welcome and thanks to everyone for joining us for our event. I'm delighted to be moderating our first panel discussion today. We've had some really interesting addresses for the first part of our event that have touched on some of the nuances relating to net zero. And now we plan on exploring some of these topics a little further with our panel discussion on net zero and how to make it happen. The term net zero is at the forefront of everyone's attention. We have countries, cities, and organizations declaring net zero targets by 2050. However, achieving this bold target will require systemic shifts within the next decade, especially if we are to limit global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees. While cities and organizations are focusing on their own decarbonization efforts, increasing consideration needs to be given to their ecosystems and building partnerships with value chain and other actors to overcome reticence and obstacles and harness opportunities for the transition. And crucial to this will be transparency on own and others' carbon data and performance, creating that emphasis on transparency for scope 1, 2, and 3 data, and decarbonization actions being undertaken, which will help organizations understand where increased focus is required and help drive broader change and turn climate risk into viable business outcomes. And what we want to understand is, how will your existing measures live up to the 1.5 degree target? And what are the step changes and implementation building blocks needed within your organization and from others to accelerate this transition? This panel aims to deep dive into the business case for reducing emissions, showcase some practical insights, learnings, and examples that have successfully navigated this shift, and provide regional perspectives on how to navigate uncertainties and challenges, individually or together with different companies and actors. I'm joined by illustrious panelists today who are going to share some of their perspectives and insights on their net zero journeys. I'm going to ask each of our panelists to briefly introduce themselves, their organization, and their role. I'll start with Nazmira, followed by Michael, and then Ian. Nazmira, over to you.
Thank you, Renata. So my name is Nazmira Muller. I'm the Chief Sustainability Officer at 91. 91 is the former Investec Asset Management. We demerged with the Investec Group last year, March, during the height of COVID. And now we're completely standalone. And my roles evolved over time. I started as an economist, was most recently head of South African investments, and have now taken on a global role as Chief Sustainability Officer across our local and international business.
Great, thank you so much, Nazmira. I'll hand over to Ian.
Hi, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to those joining, and thank you for having me join you in this session. My name's Ian Hudson. I work for Anglo American. I'm based in London in the UK, and my role is head of environment. So that's quite a broad encompassing role in Anglo American, but part of my responsibilities involves looking at some of the data that underpins our carbon neutral journey and supporting our carbon neutral team and our carbon neutral journey very much across the broader spectrum of the organization. So pleased to be with you.
Thank you so much, Ian. And then lastly, I'll hand over to Michael.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. And hi, everyone. Allow me to join without the camera. I'm having issues on connectivity. So my name is Michael Quet. I work for Safaricom. I'm in charge of my environment as well as climate initiatives for Safaricom. Thank you.
Thanks, Michael. And no problem. Wouldn't be a remote conference or event without some technical difficulties. So thank you all for joining us. So it's great to have you all here. And again, thanks so much for joining us today. I'm going to dive right in and ask a couple of questions to all of our panelists first. In terms of trying to achieve this bold target of net zero, we'd like to hear your perspectives and insights on what are some of the step changes that must be pursued for this transition? What are the implementation building blocks needed? And I think together with that, what are some of the hurdles you've needed to progress? So really, how has your organization overcome internal and external challenges and dealt with these uncertainties? So I'm going to hand over to Ian first and then followed by Michael.
Thanks, Renata. I guess multifunctional question there that I think we can answer that in several different ways. So maybe easy if I break it down, into some of those constituent components that you mentioned. So I think at the top of your introduction, you mentioned the first thing that's perhaps been one of the most important parts of being able to frame, what that route looks like and what decarbonisation is within your organisation is data and the importance of that data. And I think that we're starting to see that data is not just absolutely critical for you to be able to understand what your own carbon footprint is within your organization. And as you mentioned earlier, it's now scope 1, it's scope 2, it's scope 3. It's being able to see where you sit within the broader value chain and having a view upstream as well as having a view downstream, that it's no longer just about looking very much inside at what's happening within your own operation or your own operational footprint in a particular country, that you really need to look at this, across a holistic set of boundaries. So I think that's an area where Anglo American's been investing a huge amount of time and effort, over the last few years. Hopefully some of the audience will have seen our recent climate change report as well that we issued, which I think detailed some of the ways that we've been managing that critical component of data and modeling. So building up a very detailed understanding on an operation by operation basis, what are the energy flows coming into that operation? And then you start to be able to understand what aspects of those energy flows are you able to control directly? And then to some extent, what are those energy flows that that are perhaps more indirect? So if I break that down in very simple terms, if we look at then how you look at the difference between scope 1 and scope 2, that scope 1 is for an organization like Anglo American and many other organizations in our industry sector. It's your mobile equipment, it's your how equipment is moved, it's the fuels that you use, it's diesel utilization, it's electrification levels in your mining operations, and that becomes something that then is controllable in as much as the decisions that you make around how you manage what that scope 1 footprint is then something within your control. And again, I'm sure most of you have seen and heard about Anglo American's activities in, for example, the hydrogen truck, which will be a key part of the way that diesel, is replaced in our operations. But then if you turn to something like scope 2 and you look at South Africa, for example, then that becomes a more difficult challenge than say where it may be in other parts of the world. So given the context here is really focused on Africa. But I think if you look at other countries as a way to bring examples as to how they've solved, say, something like large-scale renewable power, in some of our operations around the world, that renewable infrastructure is in place, it's reliable, and it gives us that reliable energy at the levels that our operations need to be able to give you that carbon neutral foundation. But obviously in countries that don't have that infrastructure in place, or it's still early stage, then that becomes something that's a lot more complicated to resolve. And I think that's where it sort of peels into your second point around where do you then need to look at collaborations and partnerships to start to make that happen. And obviously there's some examples of that starting to come out in South Africa now around the creation of valleys and ecosystems where you're getting together with other stakeholders, other organizations that want to create a landscape change, but recognizing that managing that purely on your own is only going to solve part of the problem. So while Anglo may be investing in, in embedded renewables for our own operations, that's not necessarily going to be what solves the problem, holistically across the board. So I think starting to engage in how things that you're going to do yourself as a company can then serve as a template and a blueprint for others to be able to come in to create, a broader, in this case, a broader renewable power capability. I guess my last point again is modeling and looking forward. So I think it's really important that when you talk about a pathway, and we've all got our goals, 2030 carbon neutral for Anglo American for 8 of our sites, and 2040 for all of our managed operations. Those timelines might seem quite far in the future, but they're not. They're very close. So looking forward and modeling, what it also tells you is that some of those key challenges you have is ambition and being able to move quite quickly. And I think that's where I'm sure some of the conversation will go with my colleagues on the panel, is when you want to move quickly, you start to understand all of the different aspects that need to come into place for you to be able to move quickly, permitting and the environmental considerations of building new infrastructure, the capabilities of the grid, and the policy framework that allows decisions like that to be made. And I'm sure those are some of the things that I'm sure we'll start to talk to. And when we think of a broader context to Africa as well, cross-border movements of power, how we wheel energy in and out of different jurisdictions that might have different resources to bring to bear. These are all the things, I guess, that we have going for us, is that those natural resources, wind, solar, thermal energy, hydro energy, Africa has an abundance of those. It's how we harness those and connect those together in the word that you used at the beginning, ecosystem, which is quite exciting, but at the same time, quite a large challenge. So perhaps I'll hand over to Michael to build on that. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ian. I think you really touched on a number of issues in the journey. So perhaps you will allow me to just give an example of what we did as an organization as Safaricom. So I think as a first step, or the first building block, as it has been said, what we did was to first of all understand our carbon footprint, and I think it's important because there's normally the saying that if you cannot measure, then you cannot reduce. So just talking about what you've talked, Ian has talked about scope 1 emissions, scope 2 emissions, and of course the scope 3 emissions. So we did an assessment. We look at where our energy sources are, and so where the emissions are, and we quickly realized that it's about the electricity that is used in our network. We have about 6,000 sites across Kenya, and most, all of them run on power. And so electricity is key. Luckily, I think for the national grid, I think we have hydro and geothermal mainly, about over 80% actually in terms of contribution. So that was one area that we looked at. But of course, power and reliability is still a key issue, and that's why we have now other sources like standby diesel generators to run the network when there is power outages. The second one was now to have an ambition. So we've set ourselves a target of being a net zero organization by the year 2050. And I remember 3 to 4 years ago when we were committing, we didn't exactly knew what it meant. But yes, we said it's the right thing to do. And so that's what we did. And then over time now, we set ourselves targets and for reduction. And so we engage partners to assist us in setting science-based targets, just to look at where our industry is and how much we should reduce over time to the year 2050. And then, of course, following that is to do a bit of monitoring, look at your consumption patterns in terms of power, and now explore opportunities and on where you need to create. It's also important to bring the whole organization together, different employees in different functions. And here I'm looking at technology, because power is mainly consumed in the technology, in the network. Looking at now which specific areas needs to be targeted, what kind of specific actions are required, what are the KPIs to be monitored in terms of reduction, and of course discussing this over time, where there are deviations we come to course correct. I think the other thing in terms of communications is letting the employees know why you are doing what you are doing. So employee engagement is important. Awareness about the ambition, the goals that has been set, what are the roles and responsibilities of each and every person in the organization. And finally, I would want to say some of the specific things that we are now looking at is renewable energy solutions for a network, energy efficiency, what kind of initiatives are required for energy efficiency, and where we cannot reduce, where we probably cannot do much because of technology, then we are also exploring carbon offsetting as a final way of getting to net zero. So I would say it's a journey that needs a lot of engagement, having everyone on board, realizing where you are, and having a road plan. Yeah, thanks, and then over to you.
Great. Thank you both so much. I think some really important touch points coming out of both of those discussions. So thank you for sharing that. Nazmeera, I'll hand over to you. Same set of questions, but from an active investor perspective, what are the implementation building blocks needed, and how are you thinking about decarbonisation of underlying assets in investments?
Thanks, Renata. So I think listening to Michael and Ian speak, it's quite heartening, because that's what we want to hear from our companies at this point in time. So as we've approached net zero at 91, it's a two-step process. First of all, we have to get our own house in order, but for us, that's much simpler than the operations the gentlemen have both spoken about. It effectively amounts to the buildings we occupy and our travel, because there's a lot of airplane travel involved in our business. And the buildings we occupy becomes quite interesting, because relative to our peers in the UK asset management space, we have a much higher carbon footprint, because more than half our people sit in Cape Town, where we're dependent on Eskom for the grid. So it's a question of what we can do around that. Beyond that, 70% of our work is around the financed emissions we have. So the investments we make and how we approach that. And I think our focus is very much around working with the companies we invest in to make sure they have a plan right now. So rather than trying to have a target of some linear 7% a year decline in carbon emissions for our portfolios, we think it's much more important and much more useful and much more likely to have a real world impact if what we're doing is making sure our companies have net zero aligned plans by 2030. Because we operate in a lot of emerging markets. So aside from our business in South Africa, which is about 30% of our total assets, we have another 30% invested in other emerging markets. So more than 60% of our book globally is invested in emerging markets, in which case very few companies in those jurisdictions have plans, but emerging markets account for 50% of emissions globally. So that's our single biggest focus at this point in time.
Great. Thank you so much for sharing that. So we know that decarbonisation is integral to business strategy, to social license and value creation. What are some of the surprising responses, value creation touch points, and business opportunities that have come from the decarbonisation process so far? So I'd like to hear from Nazmeera and Michael. So Nazmeera, if you don't mind, I'll hand over to you first, and then we'll be followed by Michael.
So I think, again, from on our own side, is engaging with potential landlords in Cape Town has been really heartening, because we've seen an openness to try and find a solution, even though I think the South African market is not as far advanced on this thinking as you would find in some European jurisdictions at this point in time. But there's real openness and a willingness to find a solution. So that's one side. On the other side, I think our investors have been a revelation, because you see a whole spectrum of approaches. We see some Northern European clients where they want us to implement 7% linear decarbonisation in emerging market portfolios, and we have to have a conversation and go on a journey with them to explain why this may not achieve the best outcome. And then we see some real questions from clients in South Africa asking us if there's a trade-off between social outcomes and climate outcomes and how we can deal with this. And then we see concerns in other parts of the world that there's a trade-off between returns and focusing on the climate. And again, we have to explain how we integrate our climate work into our assessment and pricing of risks for companies, and how we engage with companies, and how we don't operate an exclusion or divestment process. So it's had many facets to it, Renata.
Awesome. And yeah, really interesting to understand. Michael, would love to get your thoughts as well.
Yeah, thank you. So I think in our case, some of the business opportunities that have come, I think first I would say we've seen evolving technology now around our network, around energy sources. If we look back like 10 years ago, we didn't have solutions like solar, we didn't have solutions like wind. It was not really a big deal. But out of this, we are now seeing more and more of these solutions now being integrated as part of business strategy, as part of technology strategy. So we've seen growth of solar in the country. We've seen also the cost coming down, and so more and more companies are now adopting solar technology, for example, as their energy source. We've also seen different solutions around efficiency and in terms of equipment that are being purchased. More new equipments that are coming into the market are more efficient. A lot of focus now is around is not only on cost but also in the running of an equipment, even when we are doing our procurement. We've also seen business opportunities for different solutions as well. So things that probably were not there in 5-10 years ago, we are now seeing different streams of business coming up that are trying to address some of these solutions. So ultimately, it then also changes the thinking in the organization, so that they don't just look at getting into this journey as a business cost, but more of an opportunity that is there for the long term. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Michael. My next question is for Ian. Ian, I know you touched on this during your first response, but what have you found is the value of building ecosystems, partnerships, and forging new paths in creating future solutions?
It's definitely the word of the moment, I think, isn't it? Ecosystems. Whether you're sitting in some of the nature-related conversations that are happening at the moment, in spectrums like TNFD, the word ecosystems is clearly highly important from that perspective. But I think it's great that we're starting to understand what an ecosystem actually is. So I thought I'd sort of do a little bit of a breakdown of that first. I think that the nature of an ecosystem, coming from a biologist, is really an interconnected system where you've really got a good understanding of what the inflows and outflows of that are, but also the interdependencies of things that reside within that ecosystem. So when we start to talk about building an ecosystem for solving a challenge like climate change, and in particular decarbonisation, I think one must really look at the components that make up that ecosystem. So again, it comes back to that sharing of information, and particularly sharing that information, within industry, cross sectors, at a regional and national level, because it's that sharing of information that enables people to map what that ecosystem looks like. And by understanding what that ecosystem is, then you can start to see which components of that ecosystem function in which way, and then to determine who are the best players within that ecosystem to be able to impact that aspect of the ecosystem in the right way. So I think that's the first piece, is just understanding what a good ecosystem looks like before you embark on setting one up. And while the word is being used a lot, I think we must take care to really understand what an ecosystem means to us. But clearly, if what you're able to create then is an ecosystem that functions in that synergistic way, then what we're able to achieve, which is absolutely fundamental, is scale. I think to solve the problem at the speed we need to solve it, two things have to happen. One is obviously speed of movement, and the other one is scale. So getting everybody to move at pace, but also together is what's going to create scale. So for me, the ecosystem element of it is crucial, because you then start to get a sense that you've got a critical mass, and it's with that critical mass where then you can start to create that fundamental change. And putting some of those building blocks in place, like Michael mentioned, is how do you tackle things where the technology readiness curve might not be where it needs to be, or the cost curve might not be where it needs to be. And it's within that ecosystem framework where some of those things can be worked on. So innovation has a huge role to play in this. I think while there are many mature solutions that are available, to companies, countries to decarbonize, we don't have all the answers, and we need everything. So we talk a lot internally about nothing's off the table in terms of innovation and innovative ideas. And it's the innovation and it's the ability to unlock that innovation that I think the ecosystem also stimulates. Again, many companies working on those things together, collaboratively, trying to make a breakthrough. Decarbonization has a risk of being something that could be seen as a competitive advantage, as opposed to something that is a collective responsibility that we all need to do. So if one organization makes a breakthrough, you'd like to think that breakthrough can benefit the whole ecosystem. And I think that to me is one of the most important parts of having an ecosystem and having everybody functioning inside that ecosystem, is to try to make breakthroughs in parallel, because it's those breakthroughs that will ultimately enable countries, regions, the world to have a reliable pathway to zero.
Thank you so much, Ian. And exactly as you mentioned, I think it's even more important how we look at bringing everyone along on this journey with us. It's no longer just about what our organization's doing in isolation, really. The next one is for all of our panelists. So we've heard some really great points about processes so far, but what's your next challenge that you're targeting to overcome in your decarbonization journey? And any quick pointers on how you plan on navigating this? So I'll maybe start with Michael, and then I'll hand over to Nazmira and then to Ian. Michael, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Anna. So I know it might sound petty, but one of the biggest challenges that we have at the moment is around data collection. So we are speaking about 6,000 sites, some of them in remote sites. We need to understand their power consumption. We need to understand how much diesel we've consumed, and so even accessing some of the sites to get accurate data is a problem. There's also issues around technology and cost. So we are located in a developing country, Kenya. Technology is still relatively expensive compared to the business as usual scenario. So we are having investments around solar and wind being more expensive than if you are to use the normal sources of power, so to say. So I think that's still one thing. We don't also have a lot of options. So we rely almost 100% on the national grid. And where the national grid hasn't reached, then now as an organization, you need to see what kind of options available to you in terms of on generation on site. There are also issues around regulations. And so, for example, in Kenya, a lot has happened, I should say, in terms of power generation and distribution. Of course, we still have one power source or distributor, so to say. So not many options. There are also issues around mini grids and how it integrates into the national international grid. The issue of selling power to the national grid is still a challenge. Net metering, if you are to offset some of the costs depending on what you've done. We also see, I should say, a lot of global influence. So if you look at the recently ended UNFCCC conference, the COP26, some of the commitments that were made, of course, depending on where you sit, there's still, I mean, people still have different views. And I saw the issue of financing, the issue of technology transfer, the balance between mitigation and adaptation, I think is still big, also depending on which side of the world you are located. So I think those are some of the challenges that would be there. But I think with partnership, with proactive engagement, with partners, with collaboration, we should be able to scale them as we move along. Thanks.
Thank you, Michael. Nasmira, over to you.
I think there are two things for me. One is, how can we put enough solar power into our building in Cape Town to get off the grid? But more practically, is how do we move this debate with asset managers along from carbon intensity reduction? And because it's not with asset owners, so our clients. So it's not just with other managers, it's actually with our clients and our investors at this point in time. And it's not really South African investors as yet, because I think locally this discussion is in its infancy. But in other markets where there are quite significant investors into the South African market, notably into the fixed income markets, this is a growing issue. And therefore, trying to make the point that net zero pathways for emerging markets are different than they are for developed markets, that the Paris Agreement, the Rio Agreement in 1992 recognized this common but differentiated principle, and therefore we need to deal with that is one. And secondly, is what else can we use? Do we start to look at alignment measures like the proportion of companies in a portfolio that have science-based targets by some date in the future? But moving that debate along is a critical factor for me going forward, because that's how I think we can have the most impact around helping companies in emerging markets put in place proper transition plans.
Great, thank you. It's great to get that perspective from that side as well. And lastly, Ian, I'll hand over to you.
To tackle it slightly differently, Renato, I think there's many challenges, and I guess every organisation will have its own individual challenges that pertains to its own operational context, and depending upon operationally and what jurisdiction you're in, those will also change. I think one of the challenges that we're all going to face, and I think we're no different as an organisation, is wanting to continue, to have that ambition to continue to try to go as quickly as you can go. And I think partly what fuels that again is when reports come out, as we said, COP26, that sort of stronger alignment around things are happening. They're maybe happening quicker than people had anticipated. So that sense of urgency will continue to be there. And I think that's a challenge, because that sense of urgency won't go away. It shouldn't go away. But trying to do things at scale and try to do things that require, in some cases, regime shift type change, and doing that with a sense of urgency is a continued challenge. So I think it's important to be able to reflect that. And I think to pick up on what Nasmira is saying, that challenge is also then exacerbated to some extent by what makes that more difficult to do is unlocking the right type of investment and capital to come in to solve some of those large scale infrastructure challenges. It is also something that that's juxtaposed with that sense of urgency, because organizations, corporations will take their own pathways and will work on those. But as I said earlier, it's back to that. The challenge is needing everybody to act. If Anglo American solves its carbon neutral journey really quickly and does a good job itself, but others don't, then to some extent what we've done is great, and we certainly want to feel like we're leading the charge in that regard. But everybody else has to also do that. So again, I think very much that aspect of trying to get everybody to go together and to be able to keep up that pace of delivery and to be able to keep that level of ambition, in full focus brings me back to my, my original point, which I think Michael also mentioned too, is data. We need to know we're winning along the way. As you make these changes in technology or you make investments, you put new innovations into your system, you need to be able to quickly verify that you're getting those gains that you'd expect or that you've expected to. So that sort of continuous measurement and verification of progress, I think, is a challenge as well that we have to embrace. But again, it is a challenge, and making sure that you're winning as you go. Your strategy's right. You are delivering, the emissions reduction, the energy efficiency savings that you've projected and that your roadmap requires.
That's really great. Thank you so much, Ian. I see we have a really popular audience question that's been coming through, and it touches on Michael's comments around what is best in terms of setting a target and then working out how to get there, or reviewing what is practical, drafting the way forward, and setting a target accordingly. I'd be interested to hear some of our panelists' views on this, and whether you've got some insights to share. Ian, if you don't mind, I'll put you on the spot first.
It's a great question. I don't think there's a right or wrong answer, by the way. I think, again, it really depends upon what stimulates that activity and that action. I think Anglo-Americans taken a very considered approach to using data, as I mentioned, to really understand what can be done, what aspects of that ecosystem can be dealt with in what particular ways, and therefore what you end up with is some quite pragmatic target setting that is then founded in transparency with data that says this is how we're going to get there. But I don't think everybody has, a clear plan of every single element of every single building block that's required to get there today. But there's certainly I guess my personal feeling is doing the homework on that data to really understand it and then determine which aspects of that you can control, and then you prioritize that. That's my feeling on the best way to go. But I know there's others that would argue, putting a big ambitious target out there sharpens the mind, and that's what gets people moving. So I know there are other companies that are very well known out there that took a very strong leadership position on, say, being carbon negative and did that without necessarily having all the answers on how they were going to get there. So, and one could argue that's been quite successful to sharpen the mind and sharpen the focus of individuals within that organization. So my sense, again, there's no right or wrong answer, but I've got a particular interest in doing it through data and doing it by having a really good understanding of what you're dealing with and breaking it down into those constituent components.
That's great. Thank you so much. Michael, I don't know if you've got any thoughts that you'd like to share as well.
Yeah, thanks. So I think for me, for us, we were looking at the ambition and just what Ian has said. We actually didn't know exactly what we were getting ourselves into. But I must say, we are also, a technology organization, and technology has been changing so fast. There are things that we never imagined would happen in 2020, and now they have happened. We've seen even our products that we started as simple products, and we've seen them grown, 100, 1,000 times beyond our projections. So I think for us, it's about having that stretch target. And one thing we've seen, whether on personal issues, on personal targets, or on company targets, is when you have a stretch target, everyone will have their focus on that, and everyone will have their efforts, their energy, and everything to work towards that. And for an organization like ours as Safaricom, we've seen that to be working, and so we are looking at about getting stretched, aiming at things even without necessarily having all the information and technology available at the moment. But we know things will happen and things will change. I can give a quick example. It was costing 5 years ago, it was costing us 5 times to build a base transceiver station in our network, compared to the normal way of doing things. Now that cost has significantly reduced, and we are almost at an equivalent. So I think having stretch targets give people opportunity to work hard and work towards it. That's what I would say. Thanks.
That's great to share. Thank you so much, Michael. And Nazmira, I don't know if you've got any additional perspectives that you'd like to add.
Well, Renata, maybe what may be useful is how we as a manager will be assessing transition plans from companies. And it's effectively a three-step process. One is the target ambitious enough? And that's relative to the sectoral decarbonisation pathway, the country's net zero plan, or just 1.5 degree aligned. So somewhere between the three. The second is, has the plan been costed for? So does the company understand the CapEx implications, the margin implications? And the third is, can we measure progress on an annual basis? So from our perspective, having a stretch target is great, but it only gets you half the points. The market's not going to give you any benefit for it. You're not going to price for it, because having a stretch target without the costing that makes sense and without visible implementation, and the visible implementation doesn't have to be reduction in carbon emissions. It could be the capex that is going to get you there, or the offtake agreements that are going to get you there. But we need to see that progress to begin to provide the benefit of the doubt. The target alone is not going to do it.
That's great. Thank you so much, Nazmira, and great to understand both sides of it always. So I just want to thank our panelists for all the insights shared. Before we wrap up, I am going to hand over very quickly to each of our panelists for just one last quick remark or any quick reactions on the information shared and any closing messages. So really just a minute each if you've got anything to share with us. So Nazmira, we'll start off with you.
I think what is very useful in sessions like this, or I was on a National Business Initiative call this morning, is the commitment that we're seeing from companies to try and deal with this problem. I think very few have the solution as yet, but there is a real commitment to try and deal with the problem, a recognition that there is a major problem, certainly a bigger recognition than we see from some parts of our government at this point in time, though other parts are well ahead. So I'm very heartened by that. And what I hear from both Ian and Michael is that the commitment of their companies to implement this in a very practical, pragmatic way is there. And that's what we want to see in general.
Thank you. Michael, any quick reactions from you?
Yeah, thanks, Rena. Yeah, so I think for me, the race to zero is what Kenyans are good at. Kenyan athletes, that is, are good at. It's a marathon. I look at it as a marathon. It's not a sprint. We have to overcome small milestones one at a time. So long as we have a target of where we are going. I think it needs leadership. It needs a lot of business leaders to lead the way, to set ambitious targets, align their strategies. A lot of investments required from business sector as well for us to achieve and then overcome some of those challenges. I also look at partnerships and collaboration between organizations, between government and private sector as a way to go. So I think for me, we are in a marathon and we will get there. Thank you. Thank
you so much. And Ian, any last messages from you?
I'll just reiterate some of my key points. I think data enables you to understand the context, your pathways, where you're heading. I think it links exactly what Nazmira has just said. For you to be able to build a plan that's executable, that's going to work, you need to have the confidence in the information that underpins that. I think my second point is innovation. Let's stimulate as much of that as we can, and that might require investments to come in as well as companies sharing what they're doing, because innovation is going to unlock things that will help us with that marathon and those sprints. As Michael said, and then probably my last point, I think links to this aspect of ambition. Having those ambitious goals, commitment from your leadership, from your board, from your shareholders, from your stakeholders. That level of ambition is what will keep us all, working double time to meet our targets, and in some cases exceed those targets.
Thank you. Unfortunately, this brings us to the end of our session. Thank you again to our panelists for being part of this discussion and providing some valuable insights on your decarbonisation journeys, how you've been managing this transition and the increasing demand for sustainability performances of businesses, and overcoming some of the challenges you've been faced with to make net zero happen. And thank you to all of our listeners for attending our session. I'll now hand back to Ralph to introduce the next speaker, and I do hope you enjoy the next session. Thank you.